When I was a kid, I was terrified of scary movies. Half of the reason why is that I watched some ridiculously over-the-top horror movie when I was 5 years old and had nightmares for weeks. The other half is a strong aversion to being startled. As I got older, this extended to horror games. I remember getting chills when I was 11 years old and saw this scene in Resident Evil for the first time. The remake version is still pretty spooky in my opinion, but it doesn't have the same effect. In fact, nothing in video games truly scares me anymore. You could explain this away by saying I was a wimp when I was a kid, and that I grew tolerant to spooky stuff as I got older. However, there's a problem with this answer. Horror movies still scare me. Sure, it has to be above a certain level of camp and actually try to scare instead of startle, but these movies certainly exist and can creep me out. Same for a few horror books. Yet games can't do it for me anymore, and after years of thinking about it, the reason why finally clicked into place when I was playing Silent Hill 1 and 2 for the first time recently. Games are, of course, interactive. The boundary between its characters and the audience is much thinner than in any other medium. For the majority of a game's runtime, you are in total control of a character, and the line between you can blur. This is especially true in a game that has a silent protagonist that you make in a character creator, but it's also true when your character is their own entity independent of you in some scenes. This should, in theory, strengthen any situation that involves fear. In fact, this is why it took me so long to realize why video games don't scare me, because it feels so intuitive. Fear should be one of, if not the most powerful emotion that video games can invoke. When you're watching a movie, it's a character that you are passively tethered to that is in danger. You can't change anything that happens, although you may become so involved that you start yelling at them not to split up, or to not go through some spooky door that obviously leads to something horrible, but you yourself are never in any peril. When you realize this, you may wonder, why do you feel scared at all? Well, an answer, but not the only answer, is empathy. Either you are invested in a character, or you are imagining what it would be like if you were in that same situation. If you were being hunted by some unstoppable supernatural force, surrounded by zombies, stalked by nightmares. Terrifying. If you were to jump into the situation in place of the character, you can imagine how vulnerable you would be. So again, doesn't it feel so intuitive that in a video game, everything should be heightened since you are that character? You are in control, you are in the dangerous situation instead of the characters on their own. Well, turns out, no, not at all, at least not for me. Video game protagonists aren't human. You cannot fully commit to imagining what it would be like if you were to take their place because you are already in the place along with them, in addition to the superpowers every video game protagonist has. Typically, a main character in a video game can't die. Sure, they can get ripped apart, impaled through the chest, blown up, all sorts of things, but they always come back. Sometimes it's contextualized within the game's world, sometimes it's a simple reload screen and you're good as new. Better, actually, since you've learned something to avoid that same death next time. See, it's because of the interactive nature that this doesn't work. When a character is in danger in a movie or a book, there's already a set ending for them. They very well could die in the scene that you're watching, or face lasting repercussions for mistakes. There's tension because every injury and every death is canon, whereas a death in a game is a release in tension instead of cranking the pressure even higher. You hit a fail state and restart. Suddenly that monster that killed you isn't nearly as threatening anymore since you've just experienced the reincarnation superpower of your character that you always knew was there but may have blissfully ignored until now. Imagine this happening in a movie. Death ruins horror games. Now, it could be that many can still separate themselves from video game protagonists and imagine themselves with all of their real human weaknesses in their place and be spooked. I will never say that is an invalid reaction to horror games, however, doesn't it also mean that the game has failed to fully connect you with the character you're controlling? Think of it this way, there is an Olympus Mons-sized difference between holy shit, that character is going to die, and holy shit, I'm going to die. And this is all something a horror game has to deal with before deciding whether or not you can fight the spooky enemies, and whether that combat will be purposefully awkward to try and raise the tension, or something closer to an action game and an enjoyable part that isn't meant to be scary. This is where I conclude that most horror games aren't truly scary, but are instead horror themed. Not horrific on their own, they can have disturbing imagery, oppressive atmospheres, but this is done in the same way that many other genres theme their games: action combat and/or puzzle solving in a fantasy setting, sci-fi setting, historical setting, a spooky setting. This is by no means a bad thing, themes can be fantastic. To go back to Silent Hill 1 and 2, I was able to appreciate the atmosphere in both games immensely. Surprisingly so for the first game, where the dated visuals sometimes added to the experience all these years later. But I was never scared, just like no modern horror game has scared me either.
My name is Harry Mason. I'm in town on vacation.
The game that has scared me the most recently isn't a horror game at all. Although it does have some unsettling elements to it, they aren't a core part of the experience. I'm going to show it on the screen now, and I'd like for you to give me a second to explain before you shut off the video, because... Okay, still here, I'll speak quickly. Don't Starve has some elements of psychological horror, but they're kept light. You have to manage your hunger and sanity. If your sanity goes too low, you'll begin to hallucinate. Monsters will appear and fight you. Your sanity will also drop along with your health if you are caught in total darkness at night. None of this would be particularly effective, except that Don't Starve has permadeath. You can construct extra lives for yourself, but they weaken your character by lowering their maximum health, and you need to commit resources to building a new one after each death. These are substantial enough hurdles that every life is precious. So when you make a mistake and realize as night begins to fall that you are low on food, health, don't have the materials on hand to make a light source, and have only seconds to solve these problems, you may feel, oh no, I'm doomed. I'm dead, as you scramble for a way out. Death has meaning, unlike almost every horror game out there that I've played. Does this mean that I want every horror game to have permadeath? Well, yes, in a way, but it's not that easy. Like most problems that encapsulate entire genres, this is complex. It's why I've always tried to make that clear when I've criticized horror games in the past for not being scary, Soma in particular. It's not a specific failing, it's genre-wide if you can reload after dying. I also fully expect that many people will disagree with me, but just consider how much more powerful a visually terrifying enemy in a horror game would be if it also had the ability to inflict tangible consequences upon death. How much more frightened would you be if it caused you to truly consider retreat as the best option, making you say, please don't kill me, please don't kill me, please don't kill me, as you run, because if you do die, you can't simply respawn with nothing lost. And also consider the opposite, that sometimes if a fight goes so poorly for you that you wasted too many healing items and ammo, dying becomes an attractive option since you can restart and have a better second take. You may even get angry at the monster when it takes too long to kill you so you can see the reload screen. How scary is that? Of course, you can't slap permadeath onto a game, step back, and then consider it a job well done as you pat yourself on the back. The only reason it works in Don't Starve is because each playthrough is different. Each attempt is a challenge to live as long as possible, and you learn and then try again with each retry. Even here, however, having to start over can carry too harsh of a punishment when you've been playing for long enough and can cause you to give up. Transplanting this system onto a linear story game wouldn't work. Other changes would have to be made too. A drastic transformation into a roguelike is an obvious one. Randomized areas, monsters, traps, and even pieces of a story would work well in a horror game. Making you constantly uncomfortable and never going through the motions brings with it a lot of what horror needs to be successful, in my opinion. Throw in some subtle ways of messing with you, sort of like what Eternal Darkness did on the GameCube, and you may have the right recipe for a horrific game with permadeath stakes that won't be frustrating. Until Dawn on the PlayStation 4 shows that another way is possible, because it's the only modern horror game that has made me uncomfortable through its mechanics. In case you're unfamiliar, Until Dawn presents itself as a typical slasher horror movie that you control different characters in throughout its runtime. You make decisions that cause changes in the story, and sometimes these can result in death. Permanently. These dumb teenagers do not come back afterwards. Please do not think I am parading Until Dawn around as a wildly successful horror game because it has huge problems, but it's undeniable that knowing characters can die adds a great amount of tension whenever they're in danger. Especially the first time when all you know is that decisions matter and you're not aware of the specific places a character can meet their end, which is a way Until Dawn can reinforce the idea that death can become meaningless, when you look up after you're done and find out that the tension in many scenes was faked because characters can't die there. Something similar could be done in other games without resorting to permadeath leading to a game over. Imagine a Yoshi's Island style relay of characters along for the spooky ride, and if you die, then that's one dead from the roster and you move on to the next one with the other one gone forever. Or in a game like Inside or Little Nightmares, death could result in being moved to a different line of progression for a worse ending, and then an even worse one after that if you die again. The idea here is that you can still continue and finish the game if you get grabbed by the ghoulies, but that you really don't want to. The alternative is that horror games require more suspension of disbelief on the player's part, and that you should meet them more than halfway in order to be scared. I reject this idea because I don't have to do that in order to appreciate scary movies, and that I never have to adopt this mindset in order to be impressed by other genres and games. If something in a game is visually stunning or a boss fight hits the right level of challenge and engagement, the game is responsible for getting me there without me having to pretend to be along for the ride. I don't want horror games to give me the opportunity to roleplay as someone who's scared. I want to have no choice but to be scared, because that's what terror really is. It comes at you with surprising potency, hits you with a jolt, and leaves you both hot and cold at the same time, just like the jump scare that's about to appear at the end of the sentence. Just kidding, I wouldn't do that to you. Death isn't the only way to inflict punishment for being caught by a monster. In fact, as always, my proposed ideas aren't meant to be actual things that could be done, but rather demonstrations of what a game could look like on a surface level. In this case, it's to make monsters genuinely terrifying while you are in control of the game. A fail state may force you to make a difficult choice in the game's story, or ask you to choose which supporting character will receive punishment for your mistake. The balance here is to never make this punishment result in a game that is worse to play after that point, just like a setback caused by death should never become a tedious trip through repeated content no matter what the game is. The other important thing is to make sure mistakes are always the fault of the player if the punishment is going to be so severe, but that isn't an issue unique to the horror genre. What is unique is that you're meant to feel frightened, for yourself and for the character starring in the game you're playing. A character that is an immortal force of nature that can never be killed, only stricken with inconvenience. Ironically, just like the monstrous supernatural villains that slash their way through their victims throughout the course of their movies. It's a strange conflict when you realize it. It's like Superman being afraid of a spider, or Jason being afraid of some boobs. So next time you're playing a horror game, ask yourself, are you really as scared as you could be? Or are you appreciating the fiendishly realized theme of the game instead of its actual scares? And remember, no matter how weak a horror protagonist may be compared to other genres, there's no way to dismiss their immortality. You are a person safely separated from the horrific world, remotely controlling an unstoppable god, wasting the potential video games have to fully realize what we've all wondered while watching horror movies. What would I do if I was trapped in this situation? I eagerly await the game that pulls this off for the humans instead of the monster.